On October 23, 15-year-old Cassius Turvy, a Noongar Yamatji teenager from Western Australia, died after being fatally attacked 10 days earlier while walking home from school with his friends. A 21-year-old man has been charged with his murder. Just a warning, this story is about the violent death of a boy, and some viewers may find the images disturbing. Last week, Australian TV presenter Tony Armstrong criticised the Australian media's coverage of the story on Network 10's The Project.
It's not Hollywood enough. It's not Hollywood enough for Australian public and Australian media to care. Ultimately, we don't want to talk about how this is a racial incident, but ultimately, when it's all boiled down to, the value of property has been deemed more than the life of a 15-year-old black kid. The value of property. I mean, what kind of a joint are we living in? What kind of backwater are we living in?
Earlier this week, a crowd of thousands gathered in Perth to remember him, and today thousands more will gather in vigils and rallies around Australia, here in New Zealand and the US in response to the senseless death. We cross now to James Blackwell in Canberra of the Wiradjuri mob, who's a research fellow in Indigenous diplomacy at the Australian National University's Coral Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs. Kia ora, James. Thank you for joining us, and our condolences for what has happened. So do Black Lives Matter, or has the global movement dropped off?
Kia ora, and thanks for having me. Yeah, look, Black lives always matter, especially, in this country. But I do think Tony Armstrong's comment is valid, that it's not Hollywood enough. It's not, flashy or shiny enough for the Australian public to really care. It's the brutal, violent attacking of a teenager walking home from school, in his school uniform, in broad daylight, with incredibly violent and racist, overtones to the attack. It's the kind of thing that really should be front and center of national newspapers, national media. But it's just not. It's just not the kind of thing that people really want to focus on. Obviously, it's quite violent and shocking and horrifying, but that's more reason it should be front and center for us as a country here.
And from a 21-year-old man, what's the feeling among Indigenous communities around what's happened?
Absolute devastation, absolute just sadness and grief. This is exactly the kind of boy. Cassius Turvy was a young leader in his community, an outstanding kid. Bright future ahead of him. All taken away at the age of 15. Coming home from school. The police made the comment of it was wrong place, wrong time. But where else should a school kid be at 3:30 in the afternoon, other than walking home from school? So it's just I think shock at the extreme violent nature of it, but not shock at the kind of racism that has preceded and followed it. That's not surprising. That's par for the course in this country. But I think just the horror of the violence of this death, and horror at the very nature of it, and just the incredible loss, I think, for the Perth community and the Noongar Yamatji community around Cassius's death is really, really saddening.
And sometimes it takes something like this to precipitate change. Police say the motivation, though, behind the attack is still under investigation, but Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has condemned the murder as racially motivated. Why is this so important?
Yeah, look, anyone who sees this attack, it's very obvious that this is a racially motivated attack. There's no other way to put it. I think, the police have made these comments. I'm not sure why they've decided to go this route. It's very clear what this is. This is a racist attack against an Aboriginal kid in public, in daylight. It's not hard to call it anything else. It's important that we call it out for what it is, so we can do something about it. You can't fix the problem until you're willing to identify the problem. And here, very clearly, it's racism. Very clearly, it's racist violence. There was some talk about it being a vigilante attack, but or a case of mistaken identity. That's almost irrelevant to this. It's an attack against a very visible Aboriginal teen in public. If we don't call it racism, we can't even begin to move forward and address the issues that are at play here.
James, what has the family said?
They've just expressed their sadness and their shock and their deep loss. They are grieving so incredibly much. There's an outpouring of grief from the family, but also, reminding us all that, Cassius was a kid with a big heart, a kid with much love, and that we really need to be focusing on that at this time.
And what are your observations in the way the police, government and media have addressed the murder?
It's been very sad. It's been very shameful, I think, the lack of focus from politicians, from police, from media on this attack. This is a brutal murder, an absolutely horrifying incident, something that's really, when I first heard about it, really shocked me to my core, hearing what had happened. And the fact that it's not getting the attention it deserves kind of, highlights that Aboriginal lives in this country, Indigenous lives in this country, just aren't clearly seen as important. Tony Armstrong made the point that, the value of property is given more important. Yeah, the media is giving more attention to house prices or the Melbourne Cup or kind of other more trivial issues over the last week than they have this murder. And it's really shocking that our lives and our community suffering is treated so casually.
Now, we know that there's a 21-year-old man that he's been charged with murder. Do we know anything more?
No, we know he's been charged with murder and assault. So there's been some other attacks on the same and similar days around that period. We also know that he had others with him. So I'm sure we'll see, or hopefully see, further charges against other people who were involved in this incident. So hopefully we do get the full scope of the perpetrators and we do get them brought to justice, because that's the very least Cassius deserves.
James, we've also been following the story of Diamonds player Danelle Wallam, only the third Indigenous player to represent Australian netball. She unwillingly became embroiled in a sponsorship drama when Hancock Prospecting axed its $15 million deal with Netball Australia when she objected to wearing their logo due to its founder, Lang Hancock's comments about sterilising Indigenous Australians in the 1980s. What have the last few weeks been like for you and other Indigenous peoples watching the absurdity of this unfold?
I mean, it's almost been funny in a way to kind of just watch the absurdity of it. It is very absurd, but it's also a very sad reminder that this is the Australia that we still very much have. The kind of comments from Lang Hancock are indefensible. There's no way to defend the comments he made. There's no way to defend his behaviour as a person. And, the mining industry in Australia with regards to Aboriginal people has a long, flawed history. And there's no way to really kind of defend that other than apologise for it and try and do better. And so, to see Gina Reinhardt kind of come out and get very defensive and kind of, criticising woke sports people, that's not the issue here. The issue is, her father's comments that are calling for genocide of Aboriginal people and the behaviour of mining companies that is genuinely exploitative. So it kind of really just highlights the kind of systemic societal racism that still very much exists in Australia. And, there's a very kind of indirect but clear link between the kind of society that Lang Hancock grew up in and the society where a young Aboriginal boy can get murdered on the street. These things are not unrelated. It's the kind of Australia, especially WA, is the kind of place where these values that we condemn so strongly, rightly so, are still present and still have dangerous effects. It's very much a real problem here in this country.
Because this throughout the world, it's very simple, isn't it? It's very simple, and obviously billionaires are in a whole different world than the rest of us. It's very simple for someone like Gina to just simply say, look, we're sorry. These comments shouldn't have been made, but that just doesn't happen because they're living in different stratospheres to the rest of us. Why do you think this hasn't happened?
I don't think she cares enough, genuinely. I think, I don't think she thinks it's an issue. Gina Reinhardt, her billions of dollars have come from exploiting Aboriginal people's land and exploiting our mineral resources. That's how she has her money. Why would she ever think to consider the views, the hurt, the suffering caused by her father's comments in undertaking that exploitation? It's entirely built around where she made her money. And as a white billionaire in this country, I doubt she deals with a lot of Aboriginal people. I don't know her personally, obviously, but I doubt she has a lot of Aboriginal people in her life telling her that these comments are not appropriate. You really just, say sorry, acknowledge the wrong, and try to do better. But again, rich white billionaires whose money is made off of blowing up Aboriginal land, and we've all seen the tragedies of various mining companies in this country destroying sacred sites and destroying culturally important artefacts. And that's the story of the mining industry, and that's how she's made her money.
And it was an incredibly brave stance from Danelle, an incredibly brave thing for her to do. Have we heard any comments from her since then?
No, she's not spoken publicly on the incident, and that's her right to do so. You know, we all in the Aboriginal community stand strong with her. We all have solidarity with her. We saw in some games earlier, earlier in the week and last week, how much of a good player she is and the skills she brings to the sport. It's just great to see her on the team, and all the great strength and solidarity to her, and great credit to her teammates too for standing strong with her. We've seen that her teammates really support her and support her stance, and so that's been really great to see as well.
And so do we. James Blackwell, thank you so much for your time again today, and condolences for the pain and suffering that Indigenous peoples of Australia continue to have to deal with. And our love to your people across the Tasman Sea from us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.